Hi, I'm Alan Owens. I'm the Finance Administrator here at the City of Palm Beach Gardens. I'd like to welcome you to our video presentation of the FY 2021 budget. It's budget season here at the City, and our staff has carefully assessed the community's needs for the upcoming fiscal year. With the challenges our community has faced, we thought you might be interested in this year's recommendations for City Council approval. This is the first of two required public hearings on the fiscal year 2021 budget and the first reading of Ordinance 7/2020, adopting the budget for next fiscal year. Looking at the budget timeline, you can see that the Council set the maximum millage at 5.55 mils on July 16th. On July 17th, the proposed budget was issued to the Council, Budget Oversight Review Board, and posted online for the public to review. The Budget Oversight Review Board's report is currently being worked on, but we anticipate it being issued around the end of this month. That brings us to the first public hearing, which will be September 10th, with the final hearing being held on September 24th. Getting into some of the numbers for next fiscal year, let's start with a taxable valuation. The fiscal year 2021 total taxable valuation is almost $13.1 billion, which includes new construction of a little over $163 million. Existing property, excluding new construction, increased by 2.3%. Overall, the total taxable valuation is up 3.6% from the current year total of $12.6 billion. The proposed operating millage rate next year is 5.55 mils, which is the same as this year. There is also no debt service millage, so the total proposed millage is the same as this year, which is 5.55. The proposed rate of 5.55 is 2.3% above the rollback rate of 5.4254. The rollback rate is the rate that would generate the same amount of tax revenue as the current year, excluding taxes generated by new construction. Every year, we take a look at the effect of the proposed tax rate on three typical homesteaded and non-homesteaded properties. This first slide shows the impacts on three homesteaded properties with total assessed values, and that is before deducting the $50,000 homestead exemption of $250,000, $350,000, and $450,000. You can see the annual increases ranging from $32 to $57. For homeowners that escrow their taxes, we also illustrate the equivalent monthly increases, which range from $2.66 to $4.75. Being homestead properties, the Save Our Homes Amendment limits annual increases to the lesser of 3% or the prior year's CPI, which was 2.3%. So for homesteaded properties, the increase in assessed values is capped at 2.3%. We also looked at the effects on the same three properties, but assuming they were not homesteaded. When you look at the numbers, you can see the annual increases range from $32 to $57, with the monthly increases ranging from $2.66 to $4.75. The assumed increase in assessed values of these properties is 2.3%, which is the average citywide increase in taxable values. However, each property owner's situation is unique and will be different. One of the biggest questions taxpayers have is, how much of my tax bill goes to the city? As this slide illustrates, about 72 cents of every dollar the taxpayer spends goes to other taxing authorities, such as the county, school district, healthcare district, or other special taxing districts. Only about 28 cents of that dollar actually goes to the city. Expenditures and uses for all funds next year total $182.7 million. Being a service organization, personnel costs make up the largest portion of the pie at $85.8 million. Reserves for all funds total $53.4 million. Drilling down to the largest single fund of the city, the general fund revenues and sources total $134.2 million. Again, ad valorem taxes are the largest single source of revenues, with carryover fund balance being the second largest source of funds at $36.9 million. A little later in the presentation, we'll talk about the effects of COVID-19 on some of the other revenue sources next year. General fund expenditures and uses total $134.2 million. with personnel comprising the largest expenditure category at $69.6 million. Reserves account for the second largest category at $34.6 million. Included in reserves are unassigned reserves at $26 million, budget stabilization reserves at $5.2 million, economic development reserves at $2.3 million, and $1.1 million that is restricted for law enforcement purposes. This next slide illustrates how additional requirements or uses are being balanced with additional tax revenue and other sources of funding next year. In looking at the uses of funds, personnel and operating cost increased $4.6 million. There was also an overall decrease in other revenue, primarily due to COVID-19, of $1.1 million. And we had a budgeted shortfall of $2 million in the current fiscal year 2020 budget that had to be made up. To balance the budget, we are using the increase in ad valorem taxes of $2.1 million, reductions in capital outlay, debt service, and transfers of $3.4 million, and $2.2 million from budget stabilization reserves to balance the budget. Next, we'll look at some of the significant factors that affected next year's budget. As with every year, personnel and operating costs are major factors that we deal with. This year, we also had the effects of COVID-19 to deal with. We'll go into each of these areas in more detail on the following slides. Personnel costs, which comprise salaries, retirement, health, life, dental insurance, and workers' compensation insurance, increased by $3.9 million. The single largest component of personnel cost are salaries. This slide illustrates that general fund salaries next year total $46.6 million, which is an increase of $2.5 million. The major drivers of the increase are the collective bargaining agreements with the PBA, IAFF, and SEIU. In addition, a recent compensation and classification study recommended certain market adjustments for general employees. Pension expense next year totals $10.8 million, which is an increase of $974,000. Full funding has been provided per the police and fire pension actuary reports and the statutory rates for the Florida retirement system. The budget for next year includes 7 new positions, which raises the total full-time employee count to 539. It should be noted that in 2007, prior to the recession, the city had 514 positions, or 10.41 positions per 1,000 population, while the proposed total of 539 positions next year actually is less at 9.69 positions per 1,000 population. The next 2 slides give a breakdown of the 7 new requested positions next year. These include 2 communication operators funded through additional revenue generated by adding the village of Tequesta to the North County Dispatch Center, 1 administrative specialist in the legal department, and 2 fire inspectors. There is also a part-time fire training instructor requested to go full-time and 1 business analyst in the information technology department. The last major component of personnel includes health, life, dental, FICA, workers' compensation, and unemployment compensation insurance. The total for next year is $12.1 million, which is an increase of $405,000. Moving on to operating cost factors, the city has a maintenance and repair 5-year plan that is fully funded next year. The significant components of next year's plan include $442,000 for parks repairs and operating expenses, $357,800 for building repairs and maintenance, including roof maintenance, $173,000 for parking lot and sidewalk repairs, $115,000 for roadway tree trimming and plant replacement, $250,000 for the annual stormwater program, and $250,000 for the canal maintenance and dredging program. One of the biggest impacts on next year's budget that the entire state is dealing with are the impacts of COVID-19 on revenues, especially state shared sources. This slide illustrates the impact on our revenues next year compared to last year's actual collections. As you can see, sales tax, revenue sharing, communication service tax, and electric franchise fees totaled $13.4 million last year, while our projections for next fiscal year totaled $12 million, for a reduction in revenue next year of about $1.4 million. Based on the state's most recent estimates, we have made the following adjustments to revenues since the budget document was published on July 17th. We have decreased revenue sharing and communications service tax by $25,000 each. To balance the budget, we have increased two development-related revenues, permits and engineering cost recovery, by $25,000 each. This is based on growth and development continuing to outpace our projections, which we'll discuss in more detail a little bit later. Next, we'll look at some of the highlights for other funds for next fiscal year. In the Special Revenue Fund category, we have the Golf Fund, with projected revenues exceeding expenditures and a reserve balance of $201,000. We also have a Recreation Special Revenue Fund. You can see total revenues less than projected expenditures, with the difference being made up by a transfer from the general fund. Included within the Recreation Fund is the tennis operation. As you can see, this division makes about $180,000 a year, which helps to lower the transfer from the general fund. The projected reserve balance is $186,000. We also have a gas tax special revenue fund with about $921,000 in total revenues. Expenditures include street repairs, lighting, FEC maintenance, various road equipment, and striping. The reserve balance is $48,000. The city has two internal service funds. The first is the Fleet Maintenance Fund. The budget is being balanced next year using reserves that the fund had built up. Due to the new leasing program, as opposed to purchasing vehicles, the fund does not need to hold significant reserves as it had in the past. The other internal service fund is the Self-Insured Health Fund. As with the Fleet Fund, you can see the projected revenues are less than expenditures. This is due to a planned use of reserves. Even after using reserves, the fund has a total of $6.7 million being held in reserves, or 9 months of total claims. This has enabled us to increase health premium costs next year by only 1.5%. The last fund type are the capital project funds. These include the impact fee funds and the new mobility fee fund. You can see total projected revenues for all funds total $3.5 million. The only new projects budgeted next year are improvements to Campus Drive from RCA to PGA Boulevard, totaling $1.3 million in the Mobility Fee Fund. These improvements include widening the existing 5-foot sidewalk to a 12-foot trail on the west side, adding a sidewalk and two-way 10-foot bike trail with a 2-foot raised separator on the east side, providing ladder crosswalks at RCA Boulevard, a roundabout at Fairchild Avenue, and installation of a turn lane for northbound traffic turning east on PGA Boulevard. Every year, staff prepares a 10-year financial forecast as part of the annual budgeting process. This year, we have also prepared some additional analysis of recent actual results compared to projections and how those results impact our current forecast. The highlights of the 10-year forecast are reflected on the current slide and include keeping the millage flat at 5.55 through the 10-year period, no debt service millage, unassigned reserves increasing from prior projections to $26 million next year, a gradual drawdown of unassigned reserves to $24 million by 2027, but then increasing back to $26 million by 2029. Also, reserve balances comply with council policy of at least 17% of expenditures each year of the projection. And finally, budget stabilization reserves are estimated at $5.2 million in 2021, reducing to zero by 2023, but then increased to $2.2 million in 2029. This information is depicted graphically on this slide. You can see how budget stabilization reserves in the blue bars reduce to zero, but then build up to $2.2 million. Unassigned reserves in the green bars start at $26 million, reduce to $24 million in 2027, and then build back up to $26 million. And the millage rate projected to remain flat at 5.55 mils. During the review of the budget by the Budget Oversight Review Board, one of the questions asked was, if you go back 3 or 4 years, how does our projections of revenues and expenses compare to actual results? So what we did was go back to 2017 when we were preparing the fiscal year 2018 budget and looked at the projections for fiscal years 2018, 19, and 20 and compared them to actual numbers. You can see the fiscal year 2018 projections of revenues, expenses, unassigned reserves, and budget stabilization reserves in tan color. The orange bars represent actual results for fiscal year 2018. The projected fiscal year 2019 numbers are shown in the gold bars, while the actual numbers are reflected in the green bars. The projected fiscal year 20 numbers are shown in the dark blue bars, while the estimated actual amounts are shown in the purple bars. As I mentioned earlier, unassigned reserves and budget stabilization reserves are estimated to increase. One of the things you'll note from this analysis is that historical revenues and expenses have consistently been greater than projections from 3 years ago. There are several factors that account for this, including the following. On the revenue side, we have seen strong development that continues to outpace projections. We also see annexations of Bay Hill, Preserve at Bay Hill, and Rustic Lakes that were not contemplated in the projection done 3 years ago. We also had a one-time sale of property in 2019 to Seacoast for almost $900,000. And we have unanticipated FEMA reimbursements in the current fiscal year 2020, totaling about $1.8 million. On the expense side, Hurricane Irma cost in 2018 could not have been predicted. There was also an unplanned 12% increase in August of 2018 to help retain police officers, as the sheriff was heavily recruiting officers throughout the county. We also had to hire additional officers for annexed areas, and we had to meet obligations of collective bargaining contracts that were higher than projected. The conclusion that can be drawn from this analysis is that, because of the city's conservative revenue estimating policies, we have been able to offset unplanned and uncontrolled expenditures and actually increase reserves at the same time. Another question the Budget Oversight Review Board asked last year was, how does our projection of reserves a year ago compare to our current projection? We have carried this analysis out 1 year to include our fiscal year 2021 projection to the prior 2 years' projections. The first line in blue reflects the estimated total reserves that were contained in the fiscal year 2019 forecast. The orange line reflects the projected reserves in the fiscal year 2020 forecast. The gray line represents projected reserves in the current fiscal year 2021 forecast. While similar, there are some significant items to note. When we look at the prior 2 years' projections, we note the following. Both are very similar in that reserves were forecast to gradually decline as costs were incurred to service the western growth, primarily from Avenir, and then increase to around $30 million by 2028 as new construction is added to the tax rolls. Fiscal year 2020 beginning reserves were greater than fiscal year 2019 projections by about $2 million due to better than anticipated operating results. When you look at the fiscal year 2021 projection, you see the same overall trend, but it reflects a more gradual uptick in future years due to lowering our expected average annual growth rate from an average of about 3.5% to about 2.5% for the 10-year period. There's still much uncertainty as to the effects of COVID-19 on property values for the short term, and we've lowered our assumption to reflect this uncertainty, especially in the next couple of years. The fiscal year 2021 projection of total reserves as of 9/30/2029 is about $27 million, compared to the fiscal year 2020 projection of about $30 million. Unassigned reserve percentage of expenditures as of 9/30/2030 is forecast to be about 20%, which meets council policy of at least 17% for all years of the forecast. In analyzing these projections, the conclusion that can be made is that increased reserves over the last 2 years have better positioned the city to withstand lower assumed future growth in property values. The overall trend for the current forecast is the same as the prior 2 years' projections for the next 10-year period, and that is that reserves gradually decrease as expenditures are incurred to service new growth, but then gradually increase as new properties are added to the tax roll. Lastly, we'll touch briefly on the Budget Oversight Review Board. The board last met on July 23rd. At that meeting, all 5 members recommended keeping the millage at 5.55, but depending on the city's financial situation and the economy, would like serious consideration given to lowering the millage rate next year. The next meeting of the board is on August 27th, at which time their report should be finalized and ready to issue shortly thereafter. We hope this presentation helped you better understand the fiscal goals of the city and next year and beyond. We will hold 2 budget hearings for the public, one on September 10th and a second hearing on September 24th. Both hearings begin at 6 p.m. and are available for in-person attendance or viewing via live stream on the city's website. If you're unable to attend in person but would like to make a comment on the budget, you may email your statements to our city clerk, Patricia Snyder, who will read it into public record at the hearing. Thank you for taking time to be informed on the city's budget.
Okay.
Oh, hi. You caught me in some fascinating reading here, the Government Accounting Financial Reporting book. Hi, I'm Alan Owens. I hope you don't fall asleep during this presentation.
Okay.
You ready? Tell me when.
Go ahead.
Let's start over. Start over.